Want to do a quick video today as I finally figured something out, and it's a question that a lot of people have had about the primary setup. Doesn't matter if it's chain or if it's belt, it's always been wondered, and I finally figured it out. The premise behind why it does what it does, the physics, if you will. So I made these little blocks that go in there, and they basically keep this tension bolt from sliding up or down. Now, generally speaking, this little disc thing here has little notches on it, and you would pull that up, and that would select the downhill tension, and therefore it can't go back up. However, when you get into a high-powered setup, such as this one that says KO, same thing with BAC 4000, BAC 8000, whatever, and you start running high power on it, you hit an issue, and that is the chain or the belt does not really matter. The belt is less noticeable because generally speaking it's tighter as a whole, gets tighter, and it does not make any sense when you think about it. You expect this to get looser. So I finally figured it out, and I've got some examples, some little science here to talk about. How everything mechanical works, such as this for instance, is it's a transfer of energy from one place to another, and it's going to find the path of least resistance to go to. So in this case, if we take this motor and we give it power, the sprocket is going to want to turn. That's the least amount of resistance. It's not going to turn this case because the rotor's easier to turn than the case is, therefore the motor spins as we know motors spin. So as this gear turns, the top of the chain is going to get tighter, and the bottom of the chain is going to get looser. That is because it is turning clockwise, or I should say counterclockwise, that's my bad. It's turning this way, and it's pulling on this to pull on this, which then in turn moves the wheel forward. So your transfer of energy goes from this sprocket through the top of this chain, pulls on this sprocket, goes through your axle, and then across through the thing I can't think of for some odd reason, your jack shaft, over to your other sprocket, and then again it pulls on the top side of the chain, which then goes to the back, and then when it hits the back, obviously it can't rip the wheel forward, so therefore we get turn out of it. So the question has always been, why in the world, especially with primary chains, does this stupid chain keep tightening? Doesn't matter if it's a 420 chain or the 220 or 280 or whatever the hell the other thing's called. Doesn't matter which chain you use, it always gets tighter. So I can set this thing perfect slack, go out, do a 1 or 2 mile rip, and that thing will be so tight it'll start like binding itself up because it's so ridiculously tight. Now, the first thought that you have for this is that when this motor gets a lot of torque, the only thing stopping this motor from rotating as opposed to pulling the chain, because at some point or another the bolts have to overcome the torque of rotation of the motor in order to pull that chain. If they didn't, let's say these bolts weren't in there, obviously it can't pull the chain because the motor's easier to move, therefore it just would wrap the motor up and do whatever it wants with it. So we put these bolts in there. However, you have these bolts here, which are the tensioners, they go up and down. It can move those because it's on a nice, powder-coated surface. It can slide that up and down. Even if you torque these to spec, it doesn't really matter because you're talking about so much power and torque that is being transferred through here. It's easier to twist the motor than it is to that. Now, the first thought, and the whole premise of this video, is that this motor is going to turn up. It's going to twist up because it's trying to kind of pull up on the chain, I guess if you will, walk on it, kind of like a rack and pinion effect. It's going to try to walk on that chain. However, that is actually not what's happening. And we know this because the chain gets tighter. The chain does not get looser. If it was getting looser, we would know that the motor's being pulled up. It gets tighter. Which is, of course, like I just mentioned, it sounds counterintuitive. However, if you think about it, it's not. And that is because, like I just mentioned, this is easier to overcome, therefore it can slide. The motor is actually going to turn downward, because the opposite of this sprocket going this way is the motor going this way. So to demonstrate that, I've got a simple drill here. what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a zip tie on the drill, and I'll show you something. So here you can see I've got the drill going. Got a zip tied trigger on. This, for all examples purposes, this is your surron motor. This is your sprocket. It's pulling the chain. We're moving along. Now what happens when you floor it? Well, if you think about that energy again, the energy is trying to pull on this chain. Well, if it can't pull on that chain, it's going to find the next easiest route of escape, which in this case is this bolt. So let's see what happens if I put a load on this sprocket. This is our theoretical sprocket. Let's see what happens if I put a load on it. As you can see, the motor wants to go backwards, which, in the case of our example, the motor is going to go downhill, not uphill like we thought. I am an industrial maintenance mechanic, so mechanical things is nothing new to me, but for some reason, it struck me that it should be going uphill because it's trying to pull on that chain, therefore it should try to pull closer to the sprocket if it overcomes the tension that these bolts hold back. However, that's not true, because it's going to try to rotate the motor in the opposing direction of the sprocket. So like is shown here, your sprocket's going along forward, yada yada yada, and then you floor it, which is then going to, put a large load right here, and your motor is going to be the easiest thing to rotate because of, again, a slippery slope here. And exactly what it does is, it goes clockwise, which, if you again look at this, clockwise is downhill. The motor is going to go just like that, and it tightens it up. So this might not be a mystery for everybody, but it was a mystery for me, and I know I talked to another guy on here that said that it was a mystery for him, and now it finally makes sense, because again, my first thought was that the motor was actually going to loosen itself, because if you think about it, this chain side here is going to be just slack as slack could be. It's just going to sit there and do whatever it wants to do. This side, on the other hand, is going to be very tight because that motor is actively pulling on it this way, and it's pulling this sprocket down. So the thought process was that it would kind of like walk up like this, if that makes sense, hopefully. So you'd think that the motor would get looser, but of course after every ride it's like, man, why is this stupid chain tight again? And as the drill showed, that's why. It actually rotates itself in the opposite direction and pulls this down. So if you hadn't seen the post yet, I made a spacer that slips in here that actually locks this bolt head from going up and down so that it can't travel. So what I did was I set the tension on the chain like I wanted it, and then I measured this pocket, of course. You can see it's a rather tight fit. It's supposed to be pressed onto that bolt. The bolt head just kind of pinches it. What you do is you set this tension exactly where you want it. You take this base shape, and I have the dimensions on the post, the other post that I made, and you measure from the bottom of the head to the bottom of the pocket, and then from the top of the pocket to the top of the head, and then that distance there, assuming you have your overall distance right, that should be your head diameter. So as long as you ballpark that center and put your head diameter in there, whatever your bolt is, this is an aftermarket bolt, so it's not perfect for everybody. And then it can't move. And some people have said, well, what if the chain gets looser? Well, if the chain wears out and gets longer, because keep in mind, chains don't stretch, chains wear out. If the chain gets longer, I can just print another one. It only takes a few minutes. This is a Renthal R1 chain. It lasts a really long time. Very, very minimal stretch, and it's already got a decent amount of tension on it, so really the chances of that are pretty slim. And currently, the distance between here and here and here and here are fairly close. You can almost flip this over and get another notch of tension out of it if you needed to, but it's really not a big deal. If for some reason I'm on the trail, I always carry a little better than that usually. I always carry an Allen wrench with me that actually fits that bolt and most of the motor bolts, so that I can tension on there or loosen the motor to replace a master link or something if it falls off. So I can just pull this out, loosen that, take my spacer off, and then just do it the normal way to get it back to the vehicle. Not a big deal, but this is just an interesting thing that I figured out last night as to why these tighten up. Hope it makes sense.